The wagon lay broken like a rib cage picked clean. Around it, the prairie grass bent beneath a harsh autumn wind, whispering secrets to no one. Matthew Sullivan reined his horse to a stop, dust settling around them. The air smelled of gunpowder and something darker. Death, 3 days old at least. He had followed the sound of gunshots, pushing his stallion hard over the rolling Wyoming hills. Too late to save them, but in time to put 3 bullets into the retreating bandits. His hand had moved without thought, the Colt revolver finding its mark 3 times in rapid succession. 7 years since he'd fired at another human being. 7 years since he'd even drawn his gun with intent. Matthew dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the dry earth. 5 bodies lay scattered around the broken wagon. A family, it seemed. Blood had dried black against their clothes, their sightless eyes staring at the vast Wyoming sky. Matthew removed his hat, a gesture of respect to the dead. His eyes scanned the scene methodically, the habits of his former life as a doctor still lingering. No survivors, he thought. Then a slight movement caught his eye. Beneath the overturned wagon, half hidden in shadow, a small hand clutched a corn husk doll. Matthew approached carefully, as he would a wounded animal. Crouching down, he saw her, a child, perhaps 6 years old. Her dress was torn, face smudged with dirt and tears long dried. Her eyes were open but unseeing, staring at nothing. In shock, his mind supplied. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. No response. He knelt, offering his canteen. "It's water. You must be thirsty." The girl blinked once, twice, then reached for it with a trembling hand. She drank without looking at him, clutching the doll tighter to her chest. "Are you hurt?" Matthew asked, eyes scanning for injuries. She didn't answer, but he saw no blood on her. Looking at her, something cracked open in Matthew's chest, something he'd kept locked tight for 7 years. The girl's eyes, blue like a summer sky, reminded him so much of Catherine that it physically hurt. His daughter had been about the same age when the fever took her. "My name is Matthew," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "I have a ranch not far from here, a safe place." The girl remained silent, but her eyes finally focused on his face. Matthew made a decision then, one that would change everything. He held out his hand to her, palm up, an offering, not a demand. "Would you like to come home with me?" It was the first time he'd asked such a question to a child in 7 years. For a long moment, the girl simply stared at his outstretched hand. Then, still clutching her doll, she placed her small palm in his. Matthew's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders before lifting her gently. She weighed almost nothing, this small survivor. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, one arm securing her small frame. "I won't let go," he promised quietly. Sundown Ranch spread across 500 acres of Wyoming territory. Once it had been filled with laughter. Now it stood as a monument to what Matthew had lost. Catherine's ghost in every room, Eleanor's absence in every silence. Victoria Hernandez appeared at the door as Matthew rode up, wiping her hands on her apron. The Mexican woman's eyes widened at the sight of the child. "Dios mío," she whispered, crossing herself. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Prepare a bath and something to eat," Matthew said, dismounting with the girl in his arms. "And the guest room." Isaiah Freeman emerged from the barn, his dark skin gleaming with sweat from the day's labor. The former slave had become Matthew's ranch manager after the war. Isaiah's eyes narrowed at the sight of the child, then moved to the horizon where Matthew had come from. "Trouble?" he asked simply. "Bandits," Matthew replied. "3 of them won't be causing any more." Isaiah nodded once. "I'll fetch the sheriff tomorrow." Inside, Victoria had already filled a copper tub with warm water. She hovered nearby as Matthew set the child down on a kitchen chair. "What's your name, Pequeña?" Victoria asked gently, kneeling before the girl. The child stared blankly, still clutching her doll. "She hasn't spoken," Matthew said. "Found her beneath a wagon. The rest—" He didn't need to finish. While Victoria helped the girl bathe, Matthew retreated to his study where he kept his whiskey. The ritual was familiar. Pour 2 fingers, drink it in 1 swallow, feel the burn replace the ache in his chest. He'd been doing it nightly for 7 years. Tonight he stopped with the glass halfway to his lips. In the other room he could hear water splashing gently, Victoria's soft Spanish murmurings. He set the untouched whiskey down and returned to the kitchen. Victoria had dressed the girl in one of Catherine's old nightgowns, the fabric yellowed with age but clean. The child sat at the table, eating the stew Victoria had prepared. Her hair, now clean, was the color of wheat in sunlight. Matthew sat across from her. Tomorrow we'll go to town, find someone who can take proper care of you. The girl's hand paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth. Her eyes, so blue, so much like Catherine's, lifted to his face. No. The word hung in the air between them, small but firm. Her first word since he'd found her. No, Matthew repeated, surprised. I stay with you. Her voice was clear despite its disuse, her eyes suddenly fierce with determination. You said I could come home with you. Matthew felt something shift inside him. What's your name? He asked instead. The girl set down her spoon deliberately. Emma, she said. The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. Emma. Not his Catherine, but another girl with eyes that seemed to see right through him. I'm not the right person to take care of a child, he said quietly. You saved me, Emma replied simply, as if that settled everything. Just until we find somewhere proper for you, he found himself saying. Someone who knows how to care for a little girl. Later, after Emma had been put to bed, Matthew stood in the hallway, listening to the house settling around him. Victoria appeared beside him. What will you do with her? Matthew sighed. Take her to town tomorrow. The sheriff will know who to contact. Victoria studied him, her dark eyes knowing. She has your eyes, she said softly. Don't, Matthew warned. They both knew she didn't mean Emma. That night, for the first time in years, Matthew dreamed. Not the usual nightmares of battlefield hospitals or Catherine's fevered face, but confused images of wagons and small hands reaching for his. He woke calling out a name, not Catherine's, but Maxwell. He sat upright in bed, heart pounding, the dream already fading. At breakfast, Emma told Victoria about her doll. Her name is Sarah, she was saying. My mama made her for me. The girl looked up as Matthew entered. Good morning, she said, suddenly formal. As they prepared to leave for town, Emma watched from the porch, still in Catherine's nightgown, her doll clutched to her chest. Time to go to town, Matthew said. Emma didn't move. Will they take Sarah too? Matthew frowned, confused. Your doll? Of course. The other place didn't let me keep her. They said toys were for good children. Matthew felt a chill. What other place, Emma? Emma's face closed off. The place before Mama and Papa found me. Before Matthew could question her further, Isaiah approached. Matthew, a word. Isaiah handed him a small bundle found in the saddlebags. Inside was a child's dress, a hairbrush, and a folded piece of paper. Matthew opened it, revealing a letter addressed to someone named Judge Maxwell about evidence and children in danger. The signature was smeared, illegible. Judge Maxwell, Matthew murmured, the name from his dream suddenly real in his hands. Isaiah's expression darkened. You know that name? Judge William Maxwell, Confederate sympathizer, Matthew said quietly. His son Preston runs the bank in Redemption now. Isaiah's jaw tightened. Then maybe that attack wasn't random. She said something about the place before, Matthew said. Said they wouldn't let her keep her doll. Orphanage, maybe, or something worse. They both knew what worse could mean in the territories. Children sold or indentured, working in conditions little better than slavery. Matthew folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. I'll ask around town, quietly. When he returned to Emma, she whispered, Please don't leave me there. The words pierced Matthew's carefully constructed armor. I won't leave you anywhere you're not safe, he promised. That's all I can say for now. Redemption had grown since Matthew first arrived 7 years ago. People nodded to him as he rode down the main street, but few approached. The presence of a child on his saddle drew curious glances, whispers behind hands. Sheriff Thomas Walker looked up in surprise as Matthew entered, Emma's hand held firmly in his. Sullivan, Walker said, twice in 1 month. Must be a record. His eyes moved to Emma. And who might this be? Found her yesterday with a massacred wagon train about 15 miles east, Matthew said. She's the only survivor. Walker nodded, straightening. I'll send a deputy out to bring in the bodies. Any idea who did it? 3 men, heading south. I dealt with them. The sheriff's eyebrows rose, but he asked no further questions. Well, now, we'll need to find a place for you, young lady. That's why we're here, Matthew said. Walker scratched his beard thoughtfully. Mrs. Reed at the school might take her in temporarily. She's got a soft spot for children in need. Mrs. Reed? Matthew asked. Abigail Reed, widow, runs the school now. She's good people. As they turned to leave, Walker called after them. Sullivan, word of advice. Preston Wade's been asking questions about you lately. Might want to watch your back. Matthew stiffened. What kind of questions? Walker shrugged. Where your property lines run, that sort of thing. You know he's been buying up land all around these parts. Matthew nodded tersely. Thanks for the warning. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple white building with a bell tower. Inside, Abigail Reed was writing on the blackboard. She turned at their entrance, and Matthew found himself looking at one of the most striking women he had ever seen. Abigail Reed was perhaps 30, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. Can I help you? She asked, her voice warm. Matthew removed his hat. Matthew Sullivan. Sheriff Walker suggested I speak with you. Recognition flashed in her eyes. Mr. Sullivan, of course, the doctor-turned-rancher. She smiled at Emma. And who is this? Emma, Matthew said. I found her yesterday. Her family was killed by bandits. Mrs. Reed's smile faltered, her eyes filling with sympathy. Oh, you poor dear. Sheriff Walker thought you might be able to help, Matthew continued. She needs somewhere to stay until we can contact relatives or make other arrangements. Abigail studied Emma. She seems attached to you, Mr. Sullivan. Matthew shifted uncomfortably. I found her, that's all. Mrs. Reed stood. I would be happy to help, but my quarters are very small. Perhaps she would be more comfortable staying with you, at least for now. I could come by daily to check on her, bring some proper clothes and books. Before Matthew could respond, the door opened again. Preston Wade entered, his presence immediately filling the room. His blonde hair and beard were immaculately groomed, his smile practiced and charming. Mrs. Reed, I hope I'm not interrupting, Wade said, then noticed Matthew and Emma. Dr. Sullivan, what a surprise. Mr. Wade, Matthew acknowledged stiffly. Wade's eyes moved to Emma, a strange expression crossing his face. And who is this lovely young lady? A child in need of shelter, Mrs. Reed answered. Mr. Sullivan found her after a tragic incident. Wade's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. How fortunate she found such a capable protector. He approached Emma, who shrank back against Matthew. What's your name, child? Emma said nothing, her hand finding Matthew's and squeezing tight. Her name is Emma, Matthew supplied. Emma Harrison, we believe. Wade's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Harrison, you say? From where? We don't know yet, Matthew replied, suddenly on alert. Why do you ask? Wade waved dismissively. Just curious, always looking to help those in need. He turned to Mrs. Reed. I came to discuss the school expansion. Perhaps we could speak in private. Mrs. Reed glanced between them. Of course, Mr. Sullivan, why don't you bring Emma by tomorrow? I'll have some books and clothing ready. As they departed, Matthew felt Wade's eyes on his back. Something about the banker's interest in Emma left him deeply uneasy. That night, after Emma had been fed and put to bed, Matthew examined the letter found in the wagon. Judge Maxwell, I have uncovered evidence regarding the disappearances along the eastern rail line. Children taken, families told they died of illness. Some sold to mining operations in Colorado Territory. Others sent further west. Names and locations enclosed. Your son's involvement is clear from the financial records. I urge you to use your influence to end this practice before I am forced to bring this evidence to federal authorities. For the sake of our past friendship, I offer you this chance to make amends. Respectfully. The signature was illegible, smudged by what might have been water or blood. Isaiah entered, his expression grave. Victoria said you'd want to know. The girl, Emma, she has a mark on her shoulder. Looks like a brand, the letter W with a line through it. Matthew's blood ran cold. A brand? Like cattle? Isaiah nodded grimly. Or slaves. Wade, Matthew said. The W could stand for Wade. Or for whore, Isaiah said bluntly. Children taken for worse purposes than labor. Before Matthew could respond, a scream tore through the house. High, terrified, unmistakably Emma's. Matthew raced to the guest room. Emma thrashed on the bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. No, no, don't put me back in the dark. Matthew gathered her into his arms. Emma, wake up. You're safe. You're safe now. Emma's eyes flew open, wild with terror. For a moment, she struggled against him. Then recognition dawned. Matthew, I'm here, he said gently. It was just a dream. Emma collapsed against him, her small body racked with sobs. They were putting me back in the cellar, with the other children. It was dark and cold and... She broke off, unable to continue. Matthew held her, rocking slightly as he had once done with Catherine. No one's going to put you anywhere, Emma. I promised, remember? I won't leave you somewhere you're not safe. Will you stay? She asked, her voice small, until I fall asleep again. I'll stay, he promised. Matthew began to tell her a story about stars guiding lost travelers home. As he spoke, he felt Emma relax beside him, her breathing deepening as she drifted towards sleep. When she was finally asleep, Matthew moved to the door. In the moonlight, he could almost believe it was Catherine sleeping there. But it wasn't Catherine, it was Emma, another child who needed protection. What am I doing? He whispered to the darkness. But he already knew the answer. He was opening a door he had sworn to keep shut, letting in light and pain and the terrifying possibility of loss again. And somehow it felt like the first right thing he had done in 7 years. In the hallway, Matthew paused at Catherine's door, one he hadn't opened in years. Slowly, he turned the knob and entered. Moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the small bed, the shelf of toys, the rocking horse. Dust covered everything. Victoria had been forbidden to clean in here. He moved to the dresser where a photograph stood. Catherine at 4, smiling broadly. Beside it lay a small wooden box, intricately carved. Matthew opened it, revealing a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon. Catherine's hair, cut after her death as a remembrance. For 7 years, he had come to this room to punish himself. Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he saw not just loss, but the life that had been. Catherine's laughter, her curiosity, her fierce little spirit, so like Emma's. Matthew closed the box gently and left the room, closing the door behind him. But for the first time, he didn't lock it. The next morning, Emma joined Matthew for breakfast. I have nightmares too, she said suddenly, about the cellar. What cellar, Emma? Emma's hands tightened around her doll. Where they kept us, before Mama and Papa found me. Who kept you there? Matthew asked gently. Bad men. They said we were special, that we'd go to new homes. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Some children never came back. How did your Mama and Papa find you? They came at night. Mama said she'd been looking for me for a long time. Emma's face brightened slightly. They took me away in a wagon. We traveled at night, hid during the day. Mama said we were going to a place called Wyoming, where a good judge would help us. The judge they were taking you to. Did they ever say his name? Emma frowned in concentration. Maxwell? They said he used to be friends with Papa before the war. The men who kept you and the other children. Did you ever hear a name or see anyone important who came to visit? Emma's face clouded. There was a man who came sometimes. The other men called him Mr. Wade. He picked which children would leave. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I saw him yesterday, at the school. Matthew felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Wade had recognized Emma. He knew exactly who she was and what she had witnessed. Emma, Matthew said, his decision made. How would you like to stay here with me? Not just for now, but for longer. Emma's eyes widened. Really? You won't send me away? No, Matthew said firmly, I won't send you away. This can be your home for as long as you need it to be. Emma threw her arms around his neck. Thank you, she whispered. Over her shoulder, he saw Victoria watching, tears in her eyes. Later, Matthew told Isaiah, we're keeping her, at least until this business with Wade is resolved. I figured as much after last night. She's in danger, Isaiah. Wade recognized her. She was one of the children in his trafficking operation before her parents rescued her. That complicates things. She mentioned a cellar where they kept the children. Any idea where that might be? Isaiah considered. Wade owns property all over the county. There are rumors about an old mining operation near the river, Supposedly closed years ago, but people have seen wagons coming and going at odd hours. I'm going back to town today, Matthew decided. Need to speak with Mrs. Reed about school books for Emma. Isaiah's eyes held concern. Be careful. Wade's not a man to cross lightly. In town, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Matthew reined in his horse, telling Emma to wait with Isaiah. He pushed through to find Sheriff Walker on the steps beside a well-dressed stranger, tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed beard. One at a time, folks, Walker was saying. Mr. Pierce here is just asking questions, that's all. What kind of questions? Someone shouted. About our children? The stranger, Pierce, held up a hand. I assure you I'm simply investigating the attack on the Harrison wagon. Pierce's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Matthew. Something like recognition flickered in their depths. Sheriff, Matthew called. A word? Walker introduced them. This is Harrison Pierce, private investigator from Denver. He's looking into the attack you reported. Who hired you? Matthew asked. Pierce's smile was practiced. The Harrisons were working for clients of mine. Their deaths are concerning. Sheriff Walker ushered them into his office. Inside, Pierce's demeanor changed. Where is the child, Dr. Sullivan? He asked directly. Matthew tensed. What's your interest in her? My interest is in keeping her alive, Pierce replied. The people who killed her parents will be looking for her. She's a witness to things powerful men want to keep hidden. Things involving Preston Wade, Matthew ventured. What do you know about Wade? I know Emma was held captive with other children before her parents rescued her. I know Wade was involved somehow. Pierce cursed softly. Then she's in even more danger than I thought. The Harrisons weren't just anyone, Dr. Sullivan. James Harrison was a federal marshal working undercover. His wife, Alice, was a former Pinkerton agent. They were investigating a child trafficking ring operating across 3 states. They were taking evidence to Judge Maxwell. Pierce looked surprised. You know about that? Found a letter in their belongings. Emma mentioned they were taking her to a judge who had been friends with her father. Pierce nodded. William Maxwell. He contacted my agency after receiving a letter from Harrison warning him that his son was involved in the trafficking operation. And now the Harrisons are dead, the evidence is missing, and Wade knows Emma is with me, Matthew summarized grimly. Not all the evidence, Pierce corrected. The letter you found is part of it, and Emma herself is a witness. Sheriff Walker spoke up. You're saying Preston Wade, one of the most respected men in this county, is involved in kidnapping children? Which is why we need evidence that will stand up in court, Pierce replied. As if summoned by his name, the door opened and Preston Wade himself stepped in. Sheriff Walker, I heard about our visitor and thought I might introduce myself. His eyes moved to Pierce. Harrison Pierce, is it? I understand you're investigating a tragic attack on travelers. Wade's handshake was brief. Any relation? None, Pierce replied smoothly. Just a coincidence of names. Wade's attention shifted to Matthew. Dr. Sullivan, I trust the child as well? Emma is fine, Matthew said stiffly. Wade smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Children are precious, aren't they? So vulnerable. They need protection. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Well, I won't keep you gentlemen. Sheriff, Mr. Pierce, Dr. Sullivan. With that, Wade departed, leaving an uneasy silence. He knows, Pierce said quietly. He's warning us off. Matthew headed for the door. I need to get back to Emma. Outside, Isaiah stood alone with the horses. Emma was nowhere to be seen. Isaiah, Matthew called. Where's Emma? That school teacher, Mrs. Reed, came by, said she had books for Emma, asked if she could take her to the school. I didn't see any harm in it. Wade went right past them, Matthew realized. The 3 men set off toward the schoolhouse at a run. The door stood ajar. Matthew pushed it open, calling Emma's name. Emma stood near the blackboard, Abigail Reed beside her. But it was the third figure that froze Matthew's blood. Curtis Blackwood, a known associate of Wade's, held a gun pointed at Mrs. Reed's head. Ah, Dr. Sullivan, Blackwood drawled. Just in time to say goodbye to little Emma here. She's coming with me to meet her real family. Emma's eyes found Matthew's, wide with terror. You promised, she whispered. In that moment, everything crystallized for Matthew. The past 7 years of grief and isolation fell away, replaced by absolute clarity. He had failed Catherine through no fault of his own. He would not fail Emma. "Let them go, Blackwood," Matthew said, his voice steady. "Your quarrel is with me." Blackwood laughed. "Ain't got no quarrel with you, Doc. Just following orders. The girl comes with me, nice and quiet, and nobody gets hurt." Pierce stepped forward. "Federal agent, put down the weapon." What happened next occurred in the span of heartbeats. Isaiah drew a small derringer from his boot. Mrs. Reed drove her elbow into Blackwood's ribs. Emma dropped to the floor as Blackwood's gun went off, the bullet splintering the blackboard above her head. Matthew drew his Colt and fired once. The bullet struck Blackwood in the shoulder. Pierce followed with his own shot, hitting the man's gun hand. Blackwood screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor. Emma ran to Matthew, and he caught her as she flung herself into his arms. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe." Mrs. Reed was pale but composed. "He was waiting when we arrived. Said he was Emma's uncle, come to collect her." Pierce and Isaiah secured Blackwood, binding his wounds. The man cursed steadily, promising retribution from Wade. "We need to get him to the sheriff," Pierce said. "And Emma's somewhere safe." "The ranch," Matthew nodded. "Wade won't expect us to go back there now." "I'm coming with you," Mrs. Reed announced. "Emma needs a woman's care, and I'd feel safer away from town for now." Sheriff Walker arrived, drawn by the gunshot. "Wade?" he asked simply. "Wade," Pierce confirmed. "This one's just a hired gun. The real enemy is still out there." Walker nodded grimly. "I'll lock this one up tight. But I can't hold Wade without evidence, Sullivan." "We'll find the evidence," Matthew promised. As they rode out of town, Matthew with Emma before him, Mrs. Reed on a borrowed horse, Isaiah leading the way, Matthew felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Emma leaned back against his chest, her small body warm and trusting. "You came for me," she said, wonder in her voice. "I promised, didn't I?" Matthew replied. "And I keep my promises." As the sun began to set behind the Wyoming hills, Matthew Sullivan rode toward home with a child in his arms and a resolve in his heart. 7 years of darkness were giving way to something else. Not light, not yet, but the first faint promise of dawn. The night fell quietly around Sundown Ranch, stars emerging one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. For the first time in years, the house felt different. No longer just a shrine to what Matthew had lost, but a sanctuary for what he had found. Emma slept peacefully in the guest room, exhausted from the day's events, while Matthew and his companions prepared for what tomorrow might bring. None of them realized how quickly that tomorrow would arrive, or how it would change everything. The journey back to Sundown Ranch passed in tense silence. Matthew kept Emma close, his arm tight around her small frame as they rode. Every shadow on the trail seemed a potential threat. Every rustle in the bushes, a possible ambush. Behind them, Abigail Reed rode with the straight-back determination of a woman who had faced adversity before. Isaiah led the way, rifle across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Twilight had deepened into darkness by the time the silhouette of the ranch house appeared against the starlit sky. Victoria was waiting on the porch, her weathered face etched with worry. She rushed forward as Matthew dismounted with Emma in his arms. "Gracias a Dios," she breathed, crossing herself. "I heard gunshots in town. People are saying—" "Later," Matthew cut her off with a glance at Emma's exhausted face. "This is Mrs. Reed. She'll be staying with us for a while." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and ushered them inside. The house felt different now. Not the empty mausoleum it had been for years, but a fortress, a sanctuary against the gathering storm. "I'll prepare the second guest room," Victoria said, already moving toward the stairs. "And something to eat," Isaiah added. "It's been a long day." Matthew set Emma down gently in the kitchen. She swayed slightly, fatigue evident in every line of her small body. The events at the schoolhouse had drained what little reserve of strength she had built since he found her. "You were very brave today," he told her, kneeling to meet her eyes. Emma shook her head. "I was scared." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Matthew said. "It means doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared." A faint smile touched her lips, and she leaned forward to rest her forehead against his shoulder. The simple gesture of trust tightened Matthew's throat. Abigail Reed watched the interaction with thoughtful eyes. She had removed her hat, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. In the lamplight, her face showed signs of strain, but her composure remained intact. "That man, Blackwood," she said quietly, ensuring Emma couldn't hear. "He knew exactly when I would be taking Emma to the school. Someone told him." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Wade has eyes and ears all over town." "It's more than that," Abigail replied. "He mentioned specific details about what I had said to your ranch hand. Details he couldn't have known unless someone close to us is feeding him information," Matthew finished grimly. The thought was unsettling. Matthew had kept to himself for years, his circle of trust limited to Isaiah and Victoria. Now, with Emma's life at stake, he was forced to expand that circle to include Pierce and Mrs. Reed, both virtual strangers despite Pierce's federal credentials. Victoria returned and led Emma upstairs to wash before dinner. When they were alone, Abigail's composed facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice lower now, "I need to tell you something about my husband." Matthew raised an eyebrow, waiting. "He didn't just disappear," Abigail continued. "He was investigating missing children, specifically children who had vanished from our school and others in the county. He believes someone powerful was involved." She looked up, her green eyes intense. "The night before he disappeared, he mentioned a name. Wade." "You think Wade had him killed," Matthew said. It wasn't a question. "I know it," Abigail replied, "but I could never prove it. No one would listen to a grieving widow with suspicions, but no evidence." Her hands clenched in her lap. "When I saw Emma today, when Blackwood came for her, it was like seeing the past repeat itself. I couldn't let another child disappear." Matthew studied her. The school teacher had risked her life to protect Emma, had left the relative safety of town to join them in what was quickly becoming a dangerous crusade against one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Thank you," he said simply. Abigail nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Dinner was a subdued affair, Emma fighting to stay awake at the table. Afterward, Victoria took her upstairs to bed while the adults gathered in Matthew's study. Isaiah had brought out a bottle of whiskey, and even Abigail accepted a small glass. "Pierce called himself a federal agent," Matthew said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But something doesn't fit." Isaiah nodded. "Most federal agents I've known don't operate alone, especially not on a case this big." "Perhaps he's undercover," Abigail suggested. "Or perhaps he's not what he claims to be," Matthew countered. "We only have his word that the Harrisons were federal agents." "You don't trust him," Isaiah observed. Matthew took a sip of his whiskey. "I don't trust anyone I met after yesterday." He glanced at Abigail. "Present company partially accepted." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Wise of you, Mr. Sullivan." "So what now?" Isaiah asked. "Wade knows Emma is with us. He knows she can identify him. He won't stop coming for her." "We need evidence," Matthew said firmly. "Something that will stand up in court, something that will convince even Wade's friends in high places. Emma's testimony alone won't be enough against a man of his standing." "The letter mentioned financial records," Abigail pointed out. "If we could find those—" "They'd be at the bank," Isaiah said. "Wade practically lives in that place." Matthew stood and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. "We need to know more about this operation. Emma mentioned a cellar where children were kept. If we could find it, free any children still there." "The abandoned mine," Isaiah reminded him. "It's worth checking." "Tomorrow," Matthew decided. "I'll ride out at dawn. Isaiah, you stay here with Emma and Mrs. Reed." "I should go with you," Isaiah argued. "If Wade has men there—" "That's precisely why you need to stay," Matthew cut him off. "If something happens to me, Emma will need protection." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. Victoria stood there, her expression troubled. "The child is asking for you, Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Another nightmare, I think." Matthew excused himself and headed upstairs. In the guest room, Emma sat huddled against the headboard, her knees drawn up to her chest, her cornhusk doll clutched tightly. "They're coming for me," she whispered as Matthew entered. "In my dream, they found me again." Matthew sat on the edge of the bed. "It was just a dream, Emma." "But it wasn't," she insisted, her blue eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Wade knows where I am. He'll send more men like Mr. Blackwood." Matthew couldn't deny her fear, couldn't offer platitudes when the danger was all too real. Instead, he reached out and took her small hand in his. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it. No one is going to take you away from here. Not Wade, not anyone." "How can you be sure?" she asked. Matthew thought of Catherine, of how powerless he had been to save his daughter from fever. This was different. This was an enemy he could fight, a danger he could stand against. "Because this time, I can do something about it," he said, as much to himself as to Emma. She seemed to consider this, her small face solemn in the lamplight. "My papa used to say that good always wins in the end," she said finally. "Do you think that's true?" The question pierced Matthew like a physical blow. After the war, after losing Catherine, after Eleanor left, he had stopped believing in such simple truths. The world was not divided neatly into good and evil, and even if it were, good did not always triumph. Yet looking at Emma now, her faith still intact despite everything she had endured, he couldn't bring himself to crush that belief. "I think," he said carefully, "that good stands a better chance when good people stand together." This seemed to satisfy her. She scooted down beneath the covers, still holding his hand. "Will you tell me another story? Like the one about the stars?" Matthew smiled faintly. "I think I can manage that." He began a tale about a lone wolf who found a lost cub in the forest and took it home, only to discover that protecting the cub gave him a strength and purpose he had forgotten he possessed. As he spoke, Emma's eyes grew heavy, and soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Matthew gently withdrew his hand and stood. At the door, he paused and looked back at the small figure in the bed. For 7 years, he had lived with ghosts. Now life, fragile, precious, demanding life, had returned to his house. With it came danger, but also something he had thought lost forever: hope. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Wyoming hills. Matthew saddled his horse in the gray light, the breath of both man and beast forming clouds in the chill air. Isaiah stood nearby, his dark face etched with concern. "The abandoned mine is about 2 hours' ride southwest, near the river bend," he said. "If Wade has men there—" "I'm just scouting," Matthew assured him, checking his revolver before sliding it into his holster. "I'll keep my distance, see what I can learn without being seen." Isaiah nodded, unconvinced. "And if you find children there—" Matthew's jaw tightened. "Then I'll come back with help. Pierce, the sheriff, someone with authority." "Be careful who you trust," Isaiah warned. "Wade's influence runs deep." A sound from the porch drew their attention. Emma stood there in her nightgown, Victoria's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched silently as Matthew mounted his horse. "I'll be back before sunset," he called to her. Emma nodded once, her face solemn. No tears, no pleas for him to stay, just quiet acceptance that held a maturity beyond her years. Matthew tipped his hat to her, then urged his horse forward, away from the ranch and toward the distant hills. The morning was silent, save for the steady rhythm of hooves against earth and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. Matthew rode with purpose, his mind churning over the events of the past 2 days. His life had been upended since finding Emma, thrust suddenly into a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the borders of his ranch. And yet, there was a strange clarity to it all. For 7 years, he had existed in a fog of grief, moving through his days with no purpose beyond survival. Now, with Emma depending on him, that fog had lifted. The path forward was dangerous, perhaps deadly, but at least there was a path. The abandoned mine came into view as the sun climbed higher, a dark scar in the hillside, its timber supports weathered and gray. From a distance, it appeared deserted, the entrance partially collapsed. But as Matthew tethered his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and approached on foot, he noticed signs of recent activity: wagon tracks in the mow, a path worn through the tall grass. He crouched behind a boulder, observing. The mine entrance was blocked by a heavy wooden door that looked newer than the surrounding timbers. A padlock secured it. Off to one side stood a small cabin, smoke rising thinly from its chimney. Someone was here. Matthew watched for nearly an hour, his patience rewarded when the cabin door opened. A man emerged, heavy-set, bearded, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He walked to the mine entrance, unlocked the padlock, and disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, he emerged with 2 children, a boy and a girl, no older than Emma. Their clothes were dirty, their faces gaunt. The man herded them toward the cabin, his manner gruff but not overtly cruel. Matthew's blood ran cold. Emma had spoken the truth. Here was evidence of Wade's trafficking operation, hidden away in an abandoned mine. How many more children were inside? Where were they being taken? And how many others had already been sold to mines or worse? He needed to get back to the ranch, to Pierce and the sheriff. With witnesses and evidence, they could bring Wade to justice. Matthew began to retreat, careful to stay hidden. He had almost reached his horse when a voice behind him froze him in place. "That's far enough, mister." Slowly, Matthew turned. A second man stood 15 feet away, rifle aimed squarely at Matthew's chest. This one was younger, leaner than the first, with cold eyes and a week's growth of beard. "Just passing through," Matthew said, keeping his voice casual. "Looking for strays from my herd." "With no horse nearby? Try again." The man gestured with his rifle. "Hands up where I can see them." Matthew complied, his mind racing. The man was too far away for him to rush, and any movement toward his holstered revolver would likely earn him a bullet. "Walk," the man ordered, indicating the direction of the cabin, "and don't try anything stupid." "Jenkins," he called out, "we got company." The heavy-set man, Jenkins, appeared at the cabin door, his own rifle raised. His eyes widened slightly as Matthew was marched into the clearing. "Well, look at that," Jenkins said. "If it ain't Dr. Sullivan himself. Boss said you might come sniffing around." "Wade sent you to watch for me specifically?" Matthew asked, a cold weight settling in his stomach. Had they been betrayed? Jenkins chuckled. "Boss knows a lot of things. Knows you found something that belongs to him, for instance." He jerked his head toward the cabin. "Inside, we're going to have a nice chat while we wait for Mr. Wade to arrive." The interior of the cabin was sparse. A table, a few chairs, a stove in the corner. The two children Matthew had seen earlier huddled in the far corner, their eyes vacant with fear or resignation. 3 more children sat on the floor nearby, equally subdued. None spoke or cried out. "Sit," Jenkins ordered, indicating a chair. Matthew remained standing, his eyes on the children. "How many more are in the mine?" The younger man slammed the butt of his rifle into Matthew's back, driving him to his knees. "He said sit." Matthew got to his feet slowly, his eyes never leaving Jenkins. "Wade won't get away with this," he said as he took the chair. "People know what he's doing. Federal agents are involved now." Jenkins snorted. "You mean Pierce? That Fed's been sniffing around for months. Hasn't found a thing, and he won't." He leaned in close, his breath foul. "You know why? Because people in high places want this operation to continue. Mines need small hands to reach tight places. Fancy houses back east need maids and servants who won't run off. There's good money in children, Sullivan." Matthew's stomach turned at the casual depravity. "And Judge Maxwell? Was he one of your people in high places?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Jenkins' face. "The old man? Nah, he was a problem. Started developing a conscience in his old age." A cruel smile twisted his lips. "But problems have a way of solving themselves." "You killed him," Matthew said flatly. "Not me personally," Jenkins replied with a shrug. "But yeah, the judge had an unfortunate accident about a month back. Horse threw him into a ravine. Very sad." The pieces were falling into place. Judge Maxwell had reached out to the Harrisons after receiving evidence of his son's crimes. Wade had his father killed, then set a trap for the Harrisons. Now Emma, the last living witness who could connect Wade to the trafficking operation, was in his sights. "Wade won't be here for hours," Matthew said, thinking rapidly. "You really plan to just sit and wait?" "That's exactly the plan," the younger man said, taking up position by the window. "Boss was very specific. Hold you here, don't damage you too badly. Wait for him." "And these children?" Matthew pressed. "What happens to them?" Jenkins' face darkened. "None of your concern, Doc. They're merchandise, nothing more." Matthew glanced at the children again. 5 pairs of eyes watched him with a mixture of curiosity and dread. They had been broken somehow, their spirits crushed by captivity and fear. All except one, the smallest boy, perhaps 5 years old, who met Matthew's gaze with a flicker of defiance still alive in his eyes. "I need water," Matthew said, his mouth suddenly dry. "Been riding all morning." Jenkins nodded to the younger man. "Give him a drink, Tate. Can't have him dying of thirst before the boss gets here." Tate moved to a bucket in the corner, dipped a ladle, and brought it to Matthew. As he leaned down to offer the water, Matthew surged upward, driving his shoulder into Tate's midsection and sending them both crashing into the table. The ladle clattered to the floor, water spraying across the boards. Jenkins reached for his rifle, but Matthew was already rolling, pulling Tate's body between them as a shield. The younger man struggled, clawing at Matthew's arms, but Matthew had the advantage of surprise and desperation. "Stay back," Matthew warned, his arm around Tate's throat, "or your friend here gets hurt." Jenkins hesitated, his rifle half raised. "You're making a mistake, Sullivan. Even if you get past me, where you gonna go? The mine's 2 hours from anywhere, and you got 5 kids to deal with." "We'll manage," Matthew replied, tightening his grip on Tate, who was beginning to turn red from lack of air. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. The small boy with the defiant eyes suddenly darted forward, grabbed the fallen ladle, and swung it with all his might at Jenkins' knee. The man howled in pain, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as he stumbled. In that moment of chaos, Matthew released Tate, who fell gasping to the floor, and lunged for Jenkins. The struggle was brief but brutal. Jenkins was heavier, stronger, but Matthew fought with the desperation of a man who had found something worth fighting for. He managed to wrest the rifle away and bring it down hard on Jenkins' head. The man collapsed, unconscious. Tate was struggling to his feet, reaching for a knife at his belt. Matthew swung the rifle around, its barrel leveled at the younger man's chest. "Don't," Matthew said quietly. Something in his voice, perhaps the deadly certainty that he would pull the trigger, made Tate freeze. Slowly he raised his hands. "The keys to the mine," Matthew demanded. "Where are they?" "Jenkins has them," Tate replied, his eyes darting to his fallen companion. In his pocket, Matthew kept the rifle trained on Tate while he searched Jenkins' coat, finding a ring of keys. To the children who were watching wide-eyed, he said, "It's all right. I'm here to help. We're going to get you all home." The smallest boy, who had struck Jenkins with the ladle, stepped forward. "Are you really?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. "Really," Matthew assured him. "But first, we need to see if there are more children in the mine." Securing Tate with his own belt and Jenkins with a length of rope found in the cabin, Matthew led the children outside. The mine entrance was locked as he had seen earlier, but the keys from Jenkins' pocket included one that fit the padlock. The heavy door swung open to reveal a dark tunnel braced with timber supports. The smell that wafted out was damp and musty, tinged with something worse: unwashed bodies, waste, and fear. "Stay close," Matthew told the children, taking a lantern from the cabin. "Call out if you see anyone else." The mine tunnel extended about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Here, the horror of Wade's operation became fully apparent. The chamber had been converted into a makeshift prison. Pallets lined the walls, each with a thin blanket. Iron rings had been driven into the rock, chains attached to some. In one corner stood a bucket of the stagnant water, in another a pail serving as a latrine, and huddled against the far wall were 7 more children, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 12. They blinked in the sudden light, some raising their hands to shield their eyes, others too weak to move. "It's all right," Matthew called softly, setting down the lantern. "I'm here to help. You're free now." One of the older children, a girl with matted blonde hair, struggled to her feet. "Mister," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Are you real or are we dreaming again?" The question broke something in Matthew's chest. How long had these children been held here, dreaming of rescue that never came? "I'm real," he assured her, moving forward to examine the chains. Some of the children were shackled to the wall, though most were simply locked in the chamber. The keys from Jenkins worked on these locks as well. As Matthew freed the last child, a boy of about 8 with a festering sore on his ankle, he made a silent vow. Wade would pay for this, not just through the law, but in any way Matthew could make him suffer. Leading the children from the mine into the sunlight was like witnessing a resurrection. Some wept at the brightness, others stood in stunned silence. All were malnourished, dirty, and bearing various signs of mistreatment: bruises, sores, the vacant stare of trauma. "We need to get them to safety," Matthew said, more to himself than to the children. But how? His horse couldn't carry them all, and the nearest town was hours away even with healthy riders. The decision was made for him when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Riders approaching, at least 3, maybe more. Wade, coming to deal with him personally? Matthew hustled the children back into the cabin, his mind racing. Jenkins and Tate were still secure, but with 12 children to protect and only himself as defense, their position was untenable. "Listen to me," he told the children, keeping his voice calm despite the mounting tension. "Some bad men are coming. We need to hide." "The stream," the small boy who had helped him said. "There's a cave behind the waterfall. We found it once when they let us wash." Matthew nodded. "Good thinking. Show us, quickly." The boy led them out the back of the cabin, down a slight incline to where a small stream bubbled over rocks. They followed it for perhaps 100 yards to where it tumbled over a 10-foot drop, forming a modest waterfall. Behind it, just as the boy had said, was a shallow cave. "Everyone inside," Matthew directed, helping the weaker children navigate the slippery rocks. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear." When all 12 were hidden, Matthew turned back toward the cabin. The riders were visible now. 4 men on horseback, led by a figure in an immaculate suit. Preston Wade had arrived. Matthew concealed himself behind a boulder, watching as Wade and his men dismounted at the cabin. They disappeared inside, emerging moments later with expressions of fury. Wade barked orders, and the men began to search the area. They would find the track soon enough. The children had left a clear trail to the stream. Matthew had only one advantage, surprise, and he would need to use it well. Moving silently through the underbrush, he circled back until he was behind the searchers. Wade stood by his horse, smoking a cigar and directing his men with imperious gestures. He seemed unconcerned, confident in his power and the isolation of the mine. Matthew drew his revolver and stepped out of cover. "That's far enough, Wade." The banker turned slowly, his handsome face registering first surprise, then a calculating assessment. "Dr. Sullivan," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "This is a misunderstanding. I've come because of reports of children gone missing." "Save it," Matthew replied. "I've seen your operation. I've freed the children you were keeping like animals." Wade's expression hardened. "You're interfering in matters beyond your understanding, Doctor. There's a natural order to things. Some children are destined for greater purpose than grubbing in the dirt of a family farm. We provide opportunity. You provide slavery," Matthew countered. "And it ends today." Wade sighed, as if disappointed by Matthew's failure to grasp his vision. "You think you can stop this?" "Me? I own half the county, Sullivan. The other half owes me money. Who do you think people will believe? A respected businessman or a recluse who spent 7 years drowning his sorrows in whiskey?" "They'll believe evidence," Matthew said, "and witnesses. The children, Emma, Pierce." "Pierce," Wade spat the name. "That federal parasite has been sniffing around for months without finding anything concrete. As for Emma and these other children, well," he smiled coldly, "children have such vivid imaginations, and sometimes tragic accidents befall them." One of Wade's men had been inching toward Matthew during this exchange. Now he lunged, drawing his gun. Matthew fired first, the bullet catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. The other men reached for their weapons, but Wade raised a hand. "Hold. Dr. Sullivan is a reasonable man. We can resolve this without further bloodshed." He turned his snake-like smile on Matthew. "What is it you want, Doctor? Money? Land? Name your price." Matthew felt a cold fury build within him. "There's only one thing I want from you, Wade, justice." Wade's smile faded. "Then I'm afraid we have nothing more to discuss." He nodded to his men. "Kill him, find the children, leave no witnesses." The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Matthew dove for cover as bullets splintered the rock beside him. He returned fire methodically, each shot finding its mark. One man fell, then another. The third rushed him, knife drawn. Matthew's revolver clicked on an empty chamber. He threw the weapon aside and met the attacker with bare hands. They grappled, falling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. The man was younger, stronger. But Matthew fought with the cold determination of one who had already lost everything once and would not lose again. As they struggled, Matthew became aware that Wade was escaping, mounting his horse and spurring it away from the mine. He couldn't pursue, not while locked in combat, not with the children still hiding and vulnerable. With a surge of desperate strength, Matthew broke his opponent's grip and drove his elbow into the man's temple. The blow connected with a sickening thud, and the man went limp. Matthew staggered to his feet, breathing hard. Wade was gone, riding hard back toward redemption. Three of his men lay wounded or unconscious, but Matthew knew the banker would return with more. They needed to leave now. He gathered the children from their hiding place and led them back to the cabin. Jenkins and Tate were still secured, cursing and threatening as Matthew loaded the cabin's meager supplies onto Jenkins' wagon. "You've signed your death warrant, Sullivan," Jenkins spat. "Wade will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let him try," Matthew replied, helping the last child onto the wagon. He had found a second rifle and ammunition in the cabin, which he kept close at hand. With the smallest boy beside him on the driver's seat, Matthew snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, bearing its cargo of rescued children away from the nightmare of the mine and toward an uncertain future. The journey back to Sundown Ranch was slow and tense. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rough terrain, its passengers huddled beneath blankets against the chill wind. Matthew kept a constant watch, expecting Wade's men to materialize from every shadow. The small boy who had helped him, Daniel, he said his name was, sat beside Matthew, occasionally pointing out landmarks. The child's resilience amazed him. Despite weeks or months of captivity, Daniel maintained a spark of defiance that reminded Matthew painfully of Catherine. "Did you really come looking for us?" Daniel asked as the sun began to set. "Or did you just find us by accident?" "A bit of both," Matthew admitted. "I was looking, but I didn't know for sure what I would find." Daniel nodded, digesting this. "The other men came sometimes, took children away. They never came back." He looked up at Matthew, his eyes old in his young face. "Are we really going home?" Matthew hesitated. The truth was he had no idea where home was for most of these children. Some had been taken from distant towns, others purchased from desperate families or simply stolen from the streets. Finding their rightful places would be a monumental task. "First, we're going to my ranch," he said finally. "You'll be safe there while we figure out where everyone belongs." This seemed to satisfy Daniel, who fell silent, watching the trail ahead with the vigilance of a child who had learned the hard way that danger could come from anywhere. Night had fallen by the time they reached Sundown Ranch. The house blazed with lamplight, unusual for the normally quiet homestead. As they approached, the front door burst open, and several figures spilled onto the porch. Isaiah reached the wagon first, his expression transforming from concern to shock as he saw its cargo of children. "Matthew, what in God's name?" "They were at the mine," Matthew said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "Wade's operation. There are 12 of them." Abigail Reed appeared behind Isaiah, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. "The poor dears," she breathed. Then, recovering her composure, "Victoria's heating water. We'll need to bathe them, feed them, find clean clothes." She was already moving, the teacher in her taking charge of the situation with brisk efficiency. Victoria joined her, and together they began helping children down from the wagon, speaking softly, assessing needs with experienced eyes. Emma stood in the doorway, her small figure silhouetted against the light from within. When she saw Matthew, she ran down the steps and across the yard, stopping just short of him as if suddenly uncertain. "You came back," she said, her voice small. Matthew knelt before her, his body aching from the day's exertions. "I promised I would." Emma looked past him to the wagon, to the children being led toward the house. Recognition dawned in her eyes. "You found them," she whispered. "The other is from the cellar." Matthew nodded. "Some of them. Because of you, Emma. Because you were brave enough to tell us what happened." Without warning, Emma flung her arms around his neck, her body trembling against his. Matthew held her close, feeling something heal within him at the simple contact. Over Emma's shoulder, he met Isaiah's concerned gaze. "Wade knows," Matthew said quietly. "He came to the mine. I had to leave 3 of his men there, but he escaped. He'll be back, with more men." Isaiah nodded grimly. "Pierce returned while you were gone. Claims he was gathering evidence in town. He's inside." Matthew's suspicion of the supposed federal agent had not diminished. "Keep an eye on him," he murmured. "And postcards tonight. Wade won't wait long to retaliate." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The rescued children were bathed, fed, clothed in whatever could be found that might fit them. Mattresses were dragged from storage and arranged in the main parlor, creating a makeshift dormitory. Victoria and Abigail worked tirelessly, tending to physical needs while offering the gentle reassurance that only women seemed able to provide. Emma appointed herself assistant, fetching blankets and helping the younger children settle. Watching her, Matthew felt a surge of pride. The traumatized child he had found beneath a wagon was emerging as a caretaker in her own right, her natural compassion shining through the layers of fear and hurt. It was past midnight when Matthew finally met with Isaiah, Abigail, and Pierce in his study. The so-called federal agent paced before the fireplace, his expression troubled. 12 children, he said, shaking his head. God almighty, and you say Wade himself was there? Matthew nodded, accepting the glass of whiskey Isaiah handed him. Saw him with my own eyes. Heard him give the order to kill me and the children. There's no ambiguity here, Pierce. Wade is directly involved in trafficking children. Pierce ran a hand through his beard. This complicates things. I was hoping to build a case slowly, gather evidence without tipping our hand. Now Wade knows we're on to him. Our hand was tipped the moment Emma escaped, Abigail pointed out. Wade has been one step ahead of us from the beginning. Matthew studied Pierce over the rim of his glass. You still haven't explained your exact role in all this. Who do you work for? Where's your badge, your credentials? Pierce hesitated, exchanging a glance with Isaiah. I think it's time for complete honesty, Dr. Sullivan. He reached into his coat and withdrew not a badge, but a folded document. I am a federal agent, but not in the way you might imagine. I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, contracted by the Department of Justice to investigate a suspected trafficking ring operating across several territories. Matthew took the document, a letter of commission from the Pinkerton Agency, authorizing one Harrison Pierce to investigate criminal activities in Wyoming territory. It appeared genuine, though Matthew was hardly an expert on such matters. The Harrisons? He asked, returning the letter. You said they were federal agents. James Harrison was my partner, Pierce replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Alice was his wife, yes, but also one of the few female Pinkerton agents. They were working undercover, posing as a family traveling west. Emma was their entry into the trafficking ring, a child they claimed to have found abandoned, which they used to make contact with Wade's organization. Wait, Matthew interrupted, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Are you saying Emma isn't their daughter? Pierce looked uncomfortable. No, she's not. The real Emma Harrison died of fever 2 years ago. When James and Alice discovered Wade's operation, they needed a way in. He hesitated. They purchased a child from another trafficking ring we had infiltrated. That child is who you know as Emma. The revelation hit Matthew like a physical blow. Emma, the girl he had grown to care for, had promised to protect, was herself a victim twice over, used as a pawn in a dangerous game by the very people she had come to see as parents. Does she know? He asked, his voice hardly more than a whisper. I doubt it, Pierce replied. The Harrisons were good people, Doctor. They treated her well, planned to adopt her officially once the case was closed. They died trying to bring her to safety, trying to expose Wade's operation. Matthew drained his whiskey in one swallow, the burn doing nothing to ease the knot in his chest. So who is she? What's her real name? Where did she come from? Pierce spread his hands helplessly. We don't know. The traffickers who sold her to the Harrisons had no records, no names. She was just merchandise. He spat the word like it tasted foul. The Harrisons called her Emma because they had to call her something, and I suppose it helped them remember why they were doing what they did. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice gentle but firm. None of this changes our current situation. Wade is coming for the children, all of them, but especially Emma. We need to prepare. Isaiah nodded. The ranch can be defended, but not indefinitely, not against the kind of force Wade can bring to bear. We need the law on our side, Pierce said. With 12 rescued children and Emma's testimony, we have enough to convince the territorial authorities, if not the local sheriff. The nearest territorial office is in Cheyenne, Isaiah pointed out. 3 days' ride at least, and that's with healthy adults on good horses. With a wagon full of children. We don't have to go to them, Matthew said, his mind working rapidly despite his exhaustion. Judge Hollister is due in redemption tomorrow for the monthly circuit court. He answers to territorial authority, not local interests. If we can get the children to him, get Emma's testimony on record. Wade will have men watching the roads, Pierce warned, and the town. He won't let us near the judge. Then we don't use the roads, Matthew decided. We cut across country, approach redemption from the north where the hills provide cover. We can get within a mile of town before being exposed. Abigail leaned forward. Even if we reach Judge Hollister, will he act against someone as powerful as Wade? Men like that protect each other. Hollister is different, Isaiah said. He was a Union officer during the war, fought against slavery. If anyone will listen to charges of child trafficking, it's him. Matthew stood, his decision made. We leave at first light. Pack only what's essential, food, water, medicine. The wagon will slow us down, but we can't ask these children to ride after what they've been through. As the others filed out to make preparations, Matthew remained in his study, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The revelation about Emma's true origins gnawed at him. Did it change how he felt about her? Did it matter that she wasn't who he thought she was? No, he realized, it didn't matter at all. Emma was Emma, a child who had suffered, who had shown courage beyond her years, who had somehow begun to heal the wound in his heart that Catherine's death had left. Whatever her origins, whoever she had been before, she was his responsibility now. His to protect, his to care for. And nothing, not Wade, not his men, not the ghosts of the past, would change that. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the house. Inside, 12 rescued children slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, safe for the first time in months. Among them, Emma dreamed, perhaps of a future where shadows no longer lurked in every corner. And in his study, Matthew Sullivan prepared for war. The decision had been made, the course set. There would be no turning back now, not with so many innocent lives hanging in the balance. As Matthew stared at the map spread before him, plotting their journey to redemption and justice, he knew that by morning, their lives would all be irrevocably changed. For better or worse would depend not just on skill and courage, but on that most fickle of companions, luck. The faint light of the oil lamp caught the determination in his eyes, a man who had found something worth fighting for after years of merely existing. The sky was still dark when Matthew roused the household. Stars hung like distant lanterns above the Wyoming plains, offering just enough light to see by as they prepared for departure. The rescued children were bundled into the wagon, wrapped in blankets against the pre-dawn chill. Their faces were solemn, eyes wide with uncertainty. After their ordeal at the mine, they had learned to fear change, to distrust promises of safety. Victoria had worked through the night, preparing food for the journey and packs of medical supplies. Now she moved among the children, offering reassurance in soft Spanish and English. Isaiah checked the wagon's wheels and axles, his experienced hands ensuring everything was secure. They could not afford a breakdown once they were on the move. Pierce paced near the barn, his face taut with tension. The supposed federal agent had insisted on accompanying them to redemption, claiming his testimony would lend authority to their case. Matthew remained wary. Pierce's revelation about Emma's origins still rankled, raising questions about how much else the man might be hiding. "We're almost ready," Abigail Reed reported, approaching Matthew where he stood by the porch. In the dim light, her face looked drawn with fatigue, but her eyes were clear and determined. "The children have been fed. Those who needed medical attention have been tended to." Matthew nodded, his gaze drifting to Emma, who sat on the porch steps, her corn husk doll clutched in her hands. Since finding the other children, Emma had been quieter, more withdrawn. Matthew wondered what memories their presence had stirred, what horrors she was reliving. He crossed to her, sitting beside her on the weathered steps. "You should be in the wagon," he said gently. "It's still cold out here." Emma didn't look up. "Are they going to take me away from you?" The question caught Matthew off guard. "What makes you think that?" "I heard Mr. Pierce talking," she said, her voice small but steady. "He said I'm not really Emma, that my mama and papa weren't really mine." Matthew's jaw tightened. Pierce must have been discussing the case within Emma's hearing, careless of the damage his words might do. Another reason to distrust the man. "Listen to my," Matthew said, turning to face her fully. "It doesn't matter what name you were born with or who your first parents were. You are Emma to me, and I made you a promise, remember? I won't let anyone take you somewhere you're not safe. But if I'm not really Emma Harrison, then who am I? She asked, finally looking up at him, her blue eyes troubled in the faint light. Matthew felt something crack inside him, the last barrier around his heart giving way. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as he had once held Catherine. You're Emma, he said firmly, and if you want, you can be Emma Sullivan too. She stilled in his embrace. Like your daughter? Like yourself, Matthew corrected gently. Your own person, but under my protection, in my care, if that's what you want. Emma pulled back slightly, studying his face with a seriousness that belied her years. Forever? Not just until this is over? Forever, Matthew promised, no matter what happens today. A small smile bloomed on her face, the first real smile he had seen since the confrontation at the schoolhouse. I'd like that, she whispered. The moment was broken by Isaiah's approach. It's time, he said quietly. We need to move while we still have darkness for cover. Matthew nodded and stood, lifting Emma in his arms. Let's go then. The wagon pulled away from Sundown Ranch as the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. Isaiah drove, with Matthew riding alongside on horseback. Pierce and Abigail sat at the back of the wagon, rifles across their laps. The 13 children, Emma and the 12 rescued from the mine, huddled under blankets in the wagon bed, quiet except for an occasional whisper or muffled cough. Matthew had decided that Victoria would remain at the ranch. If they failed, if Wade's men caught them, someone needed to survive to tell the truth. She had protested, of course, but eventually yielded to the logic of his argument. As they departed, she stood on the porch, a solitary figure in the pre-dawn gloom, making the sign of the cross as they passed from sight. Instead of taking the main road, Isaiah guided the wagon across open country, following game trails and dry creek beds where possible. The going was slow, the wagon jolting over uneven ground. More than once they had to stop to clear rocks or brush from their path. But the alternative, the exposure of the main road, was too dangerous to risk. As the sun climbed higher, bringing warmth to the autumn day, the children began to stir. Some stared in wonder at the open sky above them, at the hawks soaring on thermals, at the distant mountains blue with haze. For those who had been held captive longest, this journey across the Wyoming wilderness was their first taste of freedom in months. Daniel, the small boy who had helped Matthew at the mine, seemed to appoint himself leader of the rescued children. He moved among them, offering encouragement, helping distribute the water and dried meat Victoria had packed. His resilience continued to amaze Matthew. Around midday, they paused in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and allow the children a brief respite from the confines of the wagon. As they ate a simple meal, Matthew noticed Emma sitting apart from the others, watching them with a mixture of sympathy and unease. You don't need to be afraid of them, he said, crouching beside her. They're like you. They survived. Emma shook her head. It's not that. I remember some of them from before. She hesitated. I was there longer than they were. The admission sent a chill through Matthew. How long had Emma been held in that hellish place before the Harrisons had purchased her? What had she endured that she still couldn't speak of? You don't have to talk about it, he assured her. Not until you're ready. Emma's small hand found his, her fingers cool against his palm. I want to tell the judge everything, so Mr. Wade can't hurt any more children. Matthew squeezed her hand gently. You're very brave, Emma. Braver than most adults I know. A faint smile touched her lips. You're brave too. You came for me at the school, and you saved the others by yourself. Before Matthew could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Isaiah, who had been scouting ahead, was signaling from a nearby rise. One long note followed by two short, danger approaching. Matthew was on his feet instantly. Everyone back to the wagon, he ordered, keeping his voice calm but firm. Quickly now. Pierce and Abigail helped herd the children while Matthew ran to join Isaiah. From the ridge, he could see what had triggered the warning. Riders, at least 6 of them, moving across the plain below. They were still some distance away, but their direction suggested they were cutting across to intercept the main road to redemption. Wade's men? Matthew asked, though he already knew the answer. Isaiah nodded grimly. Looks like they're sweeping the area between the ranch and town. They must have found the mine, realized we took the children. How far to redemption? Matthew asked, calculating distances in his head. 4, maybe 5 hours at our current pace, Isaiah replied. Less if we could use the main road. But we'd be exposed, Matthew finished, and those riders would spot us immediately. He studied the terrain, looking for options. To the north lay rougher country, hills and draws that would provide cover but slow their progress even further. To the east, the direction of redemption, the land gradually flattened, offering less concealment the closer they got to town. We pushed north, he decided. Stay in the broken ground as long as possible, then make a run for it when we're within sight of town. Isaiah didn't look convinced. The wagon won't handle that terrain well. And the children? They've endured worse, Matthew said grimly. We have no choice. Wade's men will have the main road watched. They returned to the wagon and quickly explained the situation to Pierce and Abigail. The school teacher's face paled slightly, but she nodded, her jaw set with determination. The children will be frightened, she said, but they'll cooperate. They understand danger. Pierce checked his rifle, his expression grim. If Wade's men find us out here, away from witnesses, they won't hesitate to kill everyone and bury the bodies where they'll never be found. That's not going to happen, Matthew said firmly. He turned to Emma, who stood nearby, listening. Remember what I promised? He asked her. She nodded solemnly. That you wouldn't let anyone take me somewhere I wasn't safe. That's right, Matthew agreed, and that goes for all of you now. He raised his voice slightly so all the children could hear. We're going to reach town and find the judge. You'll all be safe then. But the journey might get rough. I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that? 12 solemn faces looked back at him, then Daniel, the small boy from the mine, stepped forward. We can be brave, he said simply. We've been brave for a long time. The simple dignity of the statement tightened Matthew's throat. These children, who had suffered so much, were not just victims. They were survivors, each one carrying a strength that adults could only marvel at. Then let's go, he said. The wagon lurched forward again, now veering northward into increasingly rugged terrain. The hills rose around them, scattered with pine and juniper, offering concealment but making the going painfully slow. Isaiah handled the team with expert precision, guiding them through gullies and over rocky ridges that would have defeated a less skilled driver. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its downward arc when disaster struck. The wagon was crossing a dry wash when a crack like a gunshot split the air. One of the rear wheels had hit a boulder, splitting the wooden rim. Whoa, Isaiah called, hauling on the reins. The wagon lurched to a stop, listing heavily to the damaged side. Matthew was off his horse in an instant, examining the wheel. The damage was severe. Several spokes had shattered along with the rim. Not something that could be quickly repaired, even with the tools they carried. How bad? Pierce asked, joining him. Bad enough, Matthew replied grimly. We can't continue with the wagon. The children can't walk all the way to redemption, Abigail protested. Some of them are too weak, and it's still hours away. Matthew stood, dusting his hands on his trousers as he considered their options. They were effectively stranded in rough country, with Wade's men searching for them. Night would fall in a few hours, bringing cold that the children, already weakened by their ordeal, might not survive without proper shelter. We make camp here, he decided. Isaiah and I will ride to redemption, bring back the judge, and enough men to escort everyone safely to town. Splitting up is dangerous, Pierce objected. What if Wade's men find the camp while you're gone? That's why you and Mrs. Reed will stay here, Matthew replied, and find a defensible position. If trouble comes, hold them off until we return with help. It wasn't an ideal plan, but with the wagon disabled, their options were limited. They quickly set about creating a camp in a small hollow surrounded by boulders and pine trees. The natural formation offered some protection from the wind and concealment from distant observers. As Isaiah prepared the horses for the ride to redemption, Matthew knelt beside Emma. I have to go for help, he explained, but I'll be back before dark. Fear flashed in her eyes, but she mastered it quickly. With the judge? With the judge, Matthew confirmed. You'll stay here with Mrs. Reed and the others. Mr. Pierce will protect you. Emma glanced at Pierce, her expression dubious. I don't trust him, she whispered. He talks about me like I'm not a real person. Matthew couldn't disagree with her assessment. Pierce's revelation about Emma's origins had revealed a coldness, a pragmatism that put the case above the child's well-being. But he was armed and capable, and they needed every defender they could get. "Trust Mrs. Reed, then," Matthew suggested. "And remember, I'll be back as soon as I can." Emma threw her arms around his neck, hugging him fiercely. "Be careful," she murmured against his collar. "I will," he promised, holding her close for a moment before gently disentangling himself. "Be brave." With a final look at the camp, the children huddled together for warmth, Abigail organizing them into some semblance of comfort, Pierce standing guard with rifle in hand. Matthew mounted his horse and joined Isaiah. The two men rode out at a gallop, pushing their mounts as fast as the rough terrain would allow. "If we cut directly east, we can reach the main road in about an hour," Isaiah said as they rode. "Then it's a straight run to redemption." Matthew nodded, his mind still on the vulnerable camp they had left behind. "Let's just hope the judge is willing to act against Wade. He's powerful, Isaiah. Respected. Our word against his won't be enough." "We have the children," Isaiah reminded him. "Their testimony, the brand on Emma's shoulder, the conditions at the mine. That's evidence no decent man can ignore." They rode in silence after that, each lost in his own thoughts. The landscape gradually changed as they moved eastward, the hills giving way to more open country. Finally, they crested a rise and saw the main road below, a pale ribbon cutting through the prairie toward the distant smudge of buildings that was redemption. "No riders visible," Isaiah observed, scanning the road in both directions. "Might be our luck is changing." "Let's hope," Matthew replied, though experience had taught him that luck was a fickle companion at best. They urged their horses down the slope and onto the road, picking up speed on the smooth, packed earth. The animals, sensing the urgency of their riders, stretched out into a ground-eating gallop, hooves thundering on the hard surface. The sun was low in the western sky, painting the landscape in golden amber when they finally reached the outskirts of Redemption. The town seemed unusually quiet for late afternoon. Few people moved on the streets, and those who did hurried along with heads down, avoiding eye contact. "Something's wrong," Isaiah murmured as they slowed their lathered horses to a walk. "Town feels like it's holding its breath." Matthew nodded, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. They proceeded cautiously down the main street toward the courthouse, where Judge Hollister would be holding the circuit court. As they approached, they saw a small crowd gathered outside the building, voices raised in what sounded like protest. "Can't just close the court," a man was saying as they drew near. "I've waited 3 months for my case to be heard." The deputy standing on the courthouse steps looked uncomfortable. "Judge's orders, Mr. Barnes. Court suspended until tomorrow at the earliest. Some kind of emergency." "What kind of emergency?" another man demanded. "We've got business needs settling." Matthew and Isaiah exchanged glances. A suspended court session was unusual, especially for the circuit judge whose time in each town was strictly limited. "Stay with the horses," Matthew told Isaiah. "I'll find out what's happening." He dismounted and approached the deputy, who eyed him warily. The young man, Simmons, Matthew recalled his name, was new to the area, having joined Sheriff Walker's office only a few months ago. "Simmons," Matthew greeted him. "What's going on? Where's Judge Hollister?" The deputy shifted nervously. "Dr. Sullivan, didn't expect to see you in town." His eyes darted around as if looking for eavesdroppers. "Judge is at the hotel, took sick suddenly after lunch. Doctor's with him now." Matthew's medical instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of sickness? Symptoms?" Simmons shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Started vomiting during the afternoon session. Sheriff Walker had him moved to the hotel to rest." A cold suspicion formed in Matthew's mind. "And where's the sheriff now?" "At the hotel with the judge," Simmons replied. "Said I was to keep folks away, tell them court's suspended until further notice." Matthew thanked the deputy and returned to Isaiah, quickly relaying what he had learned. "Convenient timing," Isaiah observed grimly. "Judge falls ill just as we're bringing evidence against the most powerful man in the county." "Too convenient," Matthew agreed. "We need to see Judge Hollister ourselves, determine if this illness is natural or induced." They tethered their horses at the hitching rail outside the Redemption Hotel, a 2-story building that was the town's finest accommodation. Inside, the lobby was deserted save for the clerk behind the desk, who looked up nervously as they entered. "Dr. Sullivan," the man said, recognition and unease in his voice. "What brings you to town?" Heard Judge Hollister is ill, Matthew replied. I was a doctor before I was a rancher. Thought I might offer my assistance. The clerk hesitated, clearly torn between turning them away and allowing a doctor to help an important visitor. Finally, he nodded. Room 203, top of the stairs, he said. Sheriff Walker's with him now. Matthew and Isaiah climbed the stairs, alert for any sign of trouble. The corridor on the second floor was quiet, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps as they approached room 203. Matthew knocked firmly. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and Sheriff Walker's weathered face appeared. His eyes widened at the sight of Matthew and Isaiah. Sullivan, Freeman, what in blazes are you doing here? Heard the judge is ill, Matthew said evenly. I'm offering my medical expertise. Walker's expression was guarded. That's kind of you, but Dr. Hines is already attending him. Two opinions are better than one in serious cases, Matthew pressed. And I've had experience with unusual poisons during the war. Something flickered in Walker's eyes, alarm, recognition, or perhaps guilt. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door wider. Come in, he said, but quietly. The judge is resting. The hotel room was spacious but dim, heavy curtains drawn across the windows despite the fading daylight outside. On the large bed lay a figure that Matthew assumed was Judge Hollister, though it was hard to make out details in the gloom. A second man, presumably Dr. Hines, sat in a chair by the bedside. As Matthew's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could see that the judge was a man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His face was flushed, his breathing labored. A basin on the nightstand suggested he had indeed been vomiting. Dr. Hines, Sheriff Walker said, this is Dr. Sullivan, formerly of the Union Medical Corps. He's offered to consult on Judge Hollister's case. Dr. Hines stood, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. Sullivan, I've heard of you, didn't know you were still practicing. I'm not officially, Matthew admitted, moving to the bedside, but I keep my hand in. May I examine the patient? Hines hesitated, then stepped aside with a slight shrug. Be my guest. I've diagnosed acute gastritis, possibly from something he ate at lunch. He's been given laudanum for the pain and to help him rest. Matthew nodded and began a careful examination of the judge, noting the symptoms: elevated pulse, dilated pupils, dry mouth, flushed skin. The pattern was familiar from his wartime experience. Has he been delirious? Matthew asked. Hallucinations? Confusion? Some, Hines acknowledged. He was quite agitated earlier, insisted someone was trying to poison him. The doctor gave a small, dismissive laugh. Common paranoia with this type of gastric distress. Matthew exchanged a glance with Isaiah, who stood quietly by the door, his presence seemingly forgotten by Walker and Hines. The ranch manager gave a slight nod, confirming he had noted the same suspicious elements. Dr. Hines, Matthew said carefully, are you familiar with the effects of Datura stramonium, Jimson weed? Hines frowned. The plant? Of course. Causes delirium, elevated heart rate, dilated pupils. Oh! His eyes widened as he made the connection to the judge's symptoms. You think he's been poisoned with Jimson weed? It would explain the symptoms, Matthew said, and it's readily available in this region. A tincture in his food or drink would be difficult to detect by taste. Sheriff Walker stepped forward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his holstered revolver. That's a serious accusation, Sullivan. Are you suggesting someone deliberately poisoned Judge Hollister? I'm suggesting it's a possibility that should be investigated, Matthew replied evenly, especially given the timing. Timing? Hines asked, confused. Matthew straightened, fixing Walker with a direct gaze. Sheriff, we need to speak privately. It concerns Preston Wade and a matter of grave importance. Walker's expression hardened. Wade again? Sullivan, you're becoming obsessed with the man. He's a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. He's also trafficking children, Matthew said bluntly. We have evidence, witnesses, 13 children who were held captive, including the girl I found after the wagon attack. We were bringing them to Judge Hollister today when our wagon broke down. The revelation landed like a bombshell in the quiet room. Dr. Hines gasped, his hand rising to cover his mouth. Sheriff Walker's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally a calculating assessment. "Where are these children now?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Matthew hesitated, suddenly aware that he had no idea where Walker's true loyalties lay. The sheriff had always seemed fair, but in a town where Wade's influence touched everything. "They're safe," Matthew said, choosing his words with care. "Under guard. We came ahead to bring the judge to them, or to arrange safe passage to town." Walker nodded slowly. "And now you think Wade poisoned the judge to prevent him from hearing this evidence?" "It's a theory that fits the facts," Matthew acknowledged. A long silence followed. Then from the bed came a weak voice. "A theory I'm inclined to believe." All eyes turned to Judge Hollister, who had pushed himself to a sitting position, his face pale with effort. Despite his weakness, there was a steel in his gaze that suggested a man used to command. "Your Honor," Dr. Hines exclaimed, "you should be resting." The judge waved away the concern. "I've been listening. Hard to rest when one suspects attempted murder." He focused on Matthew. "You're Sullivan, the doctor who became a recluse. I remembered hearing about you." Matthew approached the bed. "Judge Hollister, I apologize for the abrupt intrusion, but time is critical. There are 13 children hidden in the hills outside town, all victims of a trafficking operation run by Preston Wade. They include witnesses who can identify him directly. One child bears his brand on her shoulder." Hollister's bushy white eyebrows rose. "A brand?" "Like cattle," Isaiah spoke up from near the door. "Or slaves." The judge's expression darkened. "I fought against slavery in the war, Mr. Freeman, Your Honor, Isaiah Freeman." Hollister nodded. "Mr. Freeman, if what you and Dr. Sullivan allege is true, this is indeed a grave matter, one that requires immediate action." He turned to Sheriff Walker. "What say you, Sheriff? You know these men. Are they trustworthy?" Walker looked torn, his gaze moving between the judge, Matthew, and Isaiah. Finally, he sighed. "Sullivan keeps to himself mostly, but he's got no reason to lie about something like this. Freeman's solid. If they say they've found trafficked children, I believe them." He paused. "But Wade is powerful, Your Honor. He has friends in the territorial capital, connections in Denver and beyond." "I don't give a damn if he has connections to the president himself," Hollister said, his voice suddenly stronger. "If he's trafficking children, he'll hang." He swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Help me up. We need to secure these children and their testimony." "Your Honor," Hines protested, "you're in no condition to travel. The poison will have to run its course," Hollister finished, "but I'll be damned if I let it prevent me from doing my duty." He looked at Matthew. "Can you provide an antidote, doctor?" Matthew shook his head regretfully. "There's no specific antidote for Jimson weed poisoning, but I can administer activated charcoal to help absorb any poison still in your system, and atropine to counter some of the effects." "Do it," Hollister ordered. "And then we ride. Sheriff Walker, gather your deputies, only those you trust implicitly. No word of this is to reach Wade or his associates." Walker hesitated. "Your Honor, if Wade is behind this poisoning, he already knows something's afoot. The moment we start gathering a force, he'll be alerted." "Then we must move swiftly," the judge said, struggling to his feet despite Dr. Hines's protests. "Sullivan, how far to where the children are hidden?" "About 3 hours by horseback," Matthew replied, "in a hollow north of the main road. Mrs. Reed, the school teacher, and a federal agent named Pierce are guarding them." Hollister nodded, swaying slightly but remaining upright through sheer force of will. "We leave within the hour. Sheriff, gather 5 men you trust with your life. Dr. Sullivan will prepare whatever medical treatment I need for the journey." He fixed Matthew with a penetrating gaze. "I want to hear everything about this trafficking operation, every detail. By the time we reach those children, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." As Walker departed to gather his men and Matthew began preparing a charcoal mixture for the judge, Isaiah moved to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain. "Matthew," he said quietly, "we have company." Matthew joined him at the window. In the street below, illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun, were 4 riders. Even from this distance, Matthew recognized Curtis Blackwood among them, the man who had tried to take Emir to the schoolhouse, who should have been in Sheriff Walker's jail. "Blackwood's free," he murmured, "and looking for us, I'd wager." Isaiah nodded grimly. "If they find our horses at the hitching post..." They'll know we're here, Matthew finished. We need to move now. He turned back to Judge Hollister, who was grimly swallowing the charcoal mixture Matthew had prepared. Your Honor, Wade's men are outside. We don't have an hour. We need to leave immediately, by the back way, if possible. The judge wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, his expression resolute despite his pallor. Then we leave now, Doctor. I've faced worse than poison and thugs in my time. He stood, steadier now, and reached for his coat. Lead the way. Through the hotel's back entrance, down an alley, and to the livery stable they went, moving as quickly as the judge's condition would allow. The stable boy, startled by their urgent arrival, was quickly dispatched with a coin and instructions to bring their horses from the hitching post outside the hotel, but only after the riders in the street had moved on. Sheriff Walker will meet us at the north edge of town, Judge Hollister said, as they saddled fresh horses. With luck, we can be well on our way before Wade realizes what's happening. Matthew wasn't so confident. Wade had demonstrated an uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of them. But with the judge now firmly on their side, they at least had the law behind them. It would have to be enough. As dusk deepened into true darkness, they rode out of redemption, a small band against a powerful enemy, racing against time to reach the vulnerable children hidden in the wilderness. Matthew rode with grim determination, his thoughts on Emma and the promise he had made her. He would return before nightfall, he had said. That promise was already broken. He could only hope it would be the last one he failed to keep. The camp was quiet when they approached, no fire or lantern to betray its location in the darkness. For a moment, Matthew feared they had come to the wrong place, or worse, that Wade's men had found the camp in their absence. But then a low whistle sounded from the shadows, Isaiah's recognition signal, and a figure emerged from behind a boulder. Sullivan? Pierce's voice tense with suspicion. That you? It's us, Matthew confirmed, with Judge Hollister and Sheriff Walker. Pierce stepped forward, rifle cradled in his arms, his face a pale oval in the moonlight. Thank God. We were beginning to think you weren't coming back. The children? Matthew asked urgently. Emma? All safe, Pierce assured him. Mrs. Reed has them bedded down in the hollow. They've been quiet, understanding the need for secrecy. Relief flooded through Matthew. He dismounted quickly, helping Judge Hollister down from his horse. The older man was barely staying upright, the rigors of the ride having taken a severe toll on his already weakened condition. Take me to them, Hollister said, his voice raspy but determined. I want to see these children for myself. Pierce led them through the rocks to the sheltered hollow where they had made camp. There, in the faint light of a carefully shielded lantern, lay the children, huddled together under blankets for warmth. Abigail Reed sat among them, her back against the boulder, a rifle across her lap. She rose as they approached, relief evident in her face. Mr. Sullivan, she greeted him, you came back. With help, he replied, indicating the judge and sheriff. Where's Emma? Abigail pointed to a small form separated slightly from the main group. Emma lay curled on her side, the corn-husk doll clutched to her chest, her blonde hair a pale smudge against the dark blanket. Matthew moved to her side, crouching down to gently touch her shoulder. Emma, he called softly, I'm back, just like I promised. Her eyes opened immediately as if she had been waiting, merely pretending sleep. Matthew, she exclaimed, sitting up and throwing her arms around his neck. You were gone so long. I was scared. I know, he murmured, holding her close. I'm sorry, but I brought the judge, just like I said I would. Emma pulled back slightly, looking past Matthew to where Judge Hollister stood, leaning heavily on Sheriff Walker's arm. Her expression grew solemn. Is that him? The judge who will stop Mr. Wade? That's him, Matthew confirmed. He wants to hear what happened to you and the other children. Can you tell him your story, Emma? It's very important. Emma nodded, her face set with determination. I can tell him everything about the cellar and the men who took us and how they marked us. Hollister approached slowly, lowering himself with a grimace to sit on a nearby rock. Despite his illness, his eyes were sharp, his attention focused entirely on Emma. Hello, young lady, he said gently. I understand you have been very brave. Would you tell me what happened to you? Take your time. Every detail is important. For the next hour, in the cold darkness of the Wyoming night, Emma spoke. She told of being taken from a street in Denver where she had been playing, of the cellar where children were kept like animals, of Wade coming to select which ones would be sent away. She spoke of the branding, the searing pain, the smell of burning flesh, her own screams. She described how James and Alice Harrison had purchased her, treated her kindly, told her they were taking her to a judge who would help stop the bad men. Throughout her testimony, Judge Hollister listened intently, occasionally asking a question to clarify a point. Sheriff Walker took notes by the light of the lantern, his face growing increasingly grim. Pierce stood apart, watching, while Abigail kept the other children calm and quiet. When Emma had finished, the judge turned to Daniel, the boy who had helped Matthew at the mine. One by one, the rescued children gave their accounts, different in specifics but similar in their horror. Some had been taken from orphanages, others from poor families who had been told they were being given to wealthy benefactors who would provide education and opportunity. All had been held at the mine or similar facilities before being sold or transported elsewhere. By the time the last child had spoken, Judge Hollister's face was a mask of cold fury. He struggled to his feet, addressing Sheriff Walker. "I've heard enough," he said. "We have multiple consistent testimonies identifying Preston Wade as the mastermind behind a child trafficking operation spanning at least 3 territories. We have evidence of kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and human trafficking." He paused, gathering his strength. "I am issuing an immediate warrant for Wade's arrest on these charges. Sheriff Walker, you will execute this warrant at first light." Walker nodded, his expression resolved. "Yes, Your Honor. My deputies and I will bring him in." "No," Matthew interjected. "Wade won't surrender peacefully. He has too much to lose. And he has men throughout the county, his own private army." Hollister considered this. "What do you suggest, O'Sullivan?" "We need to catch him by surprise," Matthew said. "He knows we're coming for him eventually, but he doesn't know we have the judge's support yet. If we move now, tonight, we might find him unprepared." "Tonight?" Walker questioned. "In the dark, with 13 children to protect?" "The children stay here with Mrs. Reed and some of your deputies," Matthew explained. "The rest of us go to Wade's estate. He lives on a large property just outside town." Pierce stepped forward. "Sullivan's right. Wade will be expecting us to follow legal channels, to make our case to the judge in open court. A night raid gives us our best chance of taking him alive." Judge Hollister nodded slowly. "Very well. Sheriff Walker, select your 3 best men to remain here and protect the children. The rest will accompany us to Wade's estate." He turned to Matthew. "Dr. Sullivan, you know the country best. You'll guide us." As preparations were made for the raid, Matthew took Emma aside. Kneeling before her, he held her small hands in his. "I have to go again," he told her gently, "to make sure Wade can't hurt any more children." Fear flickered in her eyes, but she nodded bravely. "Will you come back?" "Nothing could stop me," Matthew assured her. "And when this is over, we'll go home, to our home, just like we talked about." Emma studied his face in the faint moonlight. "You'll be careful? You won't let Mr. Wade hurt you?" "I'll be careful," he promised. "You stay with Mrs. Reed. Do exactly as she says. I'll be back before you know it." As he moved to join the others, Abigail approached him, her rifle in hand. "Bring him to justice, Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly. "For all the children. For my husband." Matthew nodded, understanding the personal stake she had in Wade's downfall. "We will." The raiding party formed up. Matthew, Isaiah, Pierce, Sheriff Walker, and 2 deputies. Judge Hollister, despite his protests, was in no condition to join them and reluctantly agreed to remain with the children. The 6 men checked their weapons one final time, then mounted their horses and rode into the night toward Preston Wade's estate and what they hoped would be the end of his reign of terror. Wade's property lay on the eastern edge of Redemption, a sprawling estate centered around a grand house built in the style of Southern plantations. The incongruity of such a building in the Wyoming Territory spoke to Wade's pretensions and his roots in the defeated Confederacy. As they approached, Matthew was struck by the isolation of the place. No neighboring farms or ranches, just Wade's domain, stretching in all directions. "There's a servant's entrance at the rear," Pierce murmured, as they tethered their horses in a grove of trees a quarter-mile from the house. "Less likely to be watched." Matthew nodded, though he wondered how Pierce knew the layout of Wade's home. Another question to add to the growing list of doubts about the supposed federal agent. But for now, they needed every advantage they could get. The 6 men moved silently through the darkness, approaching the house from the east where the shadows were deepest. No dogs barked, which seemed odd for such a remote property, but Matthew wasn't about to question their good fortune. As they neared the house, they could see lights burning in several windows despite the late hour. "Walker, you and your deputies take the front," Matthew whispered. "Isaiah, Pierce, and I will go in through the rear. If Wade tries to flee, he'll likely use a back exit." The sheriff nodded and moved away with his men, circling toward the main entrance. Matthew led the others to the servant's door Pierce had mentioned. It was locked, but Isaiah made short work of it with tools from his pocket, skills acquired during his days helping slaves escape into freedom. The kitchen was dark and empty, the hearth cold. They moved carefully through the silent house, alert for any sound that might betray a guard or servant. But the place seemed deserted save for the lights burning in what appeared to be Wade's study at the front of the house. As they approached the study door, Matthew could hear voices from within, Wade's cultured tones and another rougher voice he didn't recognize. They were arguing, though the words were muffled by the heavy door. Matthew gestured for Isaiah and Pierce to position themselves on either side of the door. Then, with a deep breath, he drew his revolver and kicked the door open. Preston Wade stood behind a large desk, a glass of whiskey in one hand, a document in the other. Across from him stood Curtis Blackwood, the man who had tried to take Emma from the school. Both looked up in shock as Matthew burst in, followed closely by Isaiah and Pierce. "Preston Wade," Matthew announced, his revolver trained on the banker's chest. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking, and a dozen other crimes. Judge Hollister has issued the warrant himself." Wade's handsome face contorted briefly with fury before smoothing into its habitual mask of control. "Sullivan Mall," he said, setting down his glass with deliberate calm. "Breaking into a man's home at night. That's a serious crime in itself." "Not when it's in service of a legal warrant," Sheriff Walker said, entering from the hallway with his deputies. "Mr. Wade, I'm afraid Dr. Sullivan is correct. You're under arrest." Wade's eyes darted around the room, assessing his options. Blackwood had already raised his hands, clearly not willing to die for his employer. The banker slowly placed the document he had been holding on the desk. "This is absurd," he said smoothly. "Whatever you think I've done, you've been misled. I'm a respected businessman. I have connections in the territorial capital, in Denver, in Washington itself. This will not end well for you, Sheriff." "Save it for the judge," Walker replied. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." For a moment, it seemed Wade would comply. Then, with a speed that belied his refined appearance, he reached beneath his desk and came up with a Derringer, a small but deadly pocket pistol. "I think not," he said coldly. "Back away, I show away at all of you. I'm leaving, and none of you are going to stop me." The tension in the room was palpable. 6 armed men facing a single opponent, yet hesitant to fire and risk a stray bullet hitting one of their own in the confined space. "Don't be a fool, Wade," Matthew said. "There's nowhere to run. The children have testified against you. We found your operations at the mine. It's over." Something flickered in Wade's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or simply calculation. "Nothing is ever truly over, Doctor. Not while one lives." His gaze shifted to Pierce. "Isn't that right, Agent?" Matthew frowned, not understanding the exchange. He glanced at Pierce, who had gone very still, his expression unreadable. "Pierce?" Matthew questioned. What happened next occurred so quickly that Matthew would later struggle to piece it together in the correct sequence. Pierce's gun shifted, no longer pointing at Wade but at Sheriff Walker. At the same moment, Wade dropped to the floor behind his desk, and the window behind him shattered as a bullet tore through it from outside. "Down!" Isaiah shouted, tackling Matthew as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The deputies returned fire, shooting at figures that had appeared in the doorway, more of Wade's men who had been hiding elsewhere in the house. Matthew found himself on the floor behind an overturned armchair, Isaiah beside him. Across the room, Sheriff Walker was down, blood spreading across his chest. One deputy was firing from behind a bookcase, while the other lay motionless near the door. And Pierce was nowhere to be seen. "Wade's escaping!" Isaiah shouted over the gunfire. "Back window!" Matthew risked a glance and saw that the banker had indeed vanished, presumably through the shattered window. Pierce too must have fled, his true allegiance finally revealed. The supposed federal agent had been Wade's man all along, playing a long game to identify threats to the trafficking operation. "Cover me," Matthew called to Isaiah. then rolled from behind the chair and made for the window, firing twice at Wade's men to keep them pinned down. The window opened onto a small garden, beyond which the darkness of the Wyoming night offered concealment. Matthew could see two figures running toward the stables, Wade and Pierce, fleeing together. Without hesitation, Matthew vaulted through the window and gave chase. Behind him, the gunfight continued, Isaiah and the remaining deputy holding their own against Wade's men. But Matthew's focus was singular. Preston Wade would not escape justice. Not after what he had done to Emma, to the other children, to countless victims across 3 territories. The stables loomed ahead, dark shapes of horses visible within. Wade and Pierce had reached them first, already mounting, preparing to flee. Matthew raised his revolver, but hesitated. The distance was too great, the targets moving, the risk of hitting the horses too high. Instead, he ran harder, his boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. He was closing the distance when Pierce saw him, raised his own gun, and fired. The bullet whizzed past Matthew's ear, close enough that he felt its passage like a hot breath. Matthew dove for cover behind a water trough as more shots rang out. The sound of hoofbeats told him the horses were in motion. Wade was escaping. He risked a look and saw 2 riders galloping away from the stables, heading east toward the open country. With a curse, Matthew ran for the remaining horses. He grabbed the reins of the nearest, a large bay that snorted in alarm at his abrupt appearance. With no time for a saddle, he swung onto the horse's bare back and urged it forward, giving chase to the fleeing criminals. The night air was cold against his face as he galloped after Wade and Pierce. The moon provided just enough light to see by, silvering the landscape in ghostly relief. Ahead, he could make out the 2 riders, pushing their mounts hard across the open plain. Matthew's horse was fresh, while theirs had been ridden earlier in the day. Gradually, he began to close the gap, though every instinct warned him that riding at such speed in darkness was courting disaster. A prairie dog hole, a sudden dip in the terrain, a loose stone, any could send horse and rider tumbling with fatal results. Yet he pushed on, driven by the faces of the children Wade had victimized, by Emma's trust, by his own promise to bring the man to justice. The distance continued to shrink, 50 yards, then 30, then 20. He could see Wade clearly now, his fine coat flapping in the wind, his hat long gone. Pierce looked back, saw Matthew gaining, and reined in slightly, raising his gun. Matthew ducked low over his horse's neck as shots rang out, disturbing the night's quiet. One bullet grazed his arm, a line of fire that he barely registered in the heat of pursuit. Then, ahead of them, the ground fell away, a ravine cutting across their path. Wade and Pierce saw it too late, their horses rearing in alarm at the sudden drop. Pierce managed to control his mount, turning aside at the last moment. But Wade's horse, perhaps less experienced or more panicked, lost its footing on the edge of the ravine. Matthew watched in horror as horse and rider tumbled into the darkness. A scream, human or animal he couldn't tell, cutting through the night. The fall wasn't far, perhaps 15 feet, but at the bottom lay rocks and the dry bed of a seasonal stream. He reined in hard at the edge, dismounting and approaching carefully. By the light of the moon, he could see Wade's horse struggling to its feet, apparently injured but alive. Of Wade himself, there was no sign at first. Then Matthew spotted him, a crumpled form among the rocks, motionless. Pierce had stopped as well, some distance away. For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes across the ravine. Former allies turned enemies by Pierce's betrayal. The agent's face was shadowed, unreadable in the moonlight. "It didn't have to end this way, Sullivan," Pierce called. "Wade offered you a deal. You should have taken it." "There's no deal with the devil that doesn't cost your soul," Matthew replied. "Turn yourself in, Pierce. It's over." Pierce laughed, a hollow sound in the night air. "Over? This operation stretches across half the West. Wade was just one man in a much larger machine." He gathered his reins. "Tell Emma I'm sorry it came to this. She was a sweet kid. Wrong place, wrong time." Before Matthew could respond, Pierce wheeled his horse and galloped away, quickly disappearing into the darkness. Matthew considered giving chase, but Wade's condition took precedence. He needed to determine if the man was still alive to face justice. Carefully, he made his way down the slope into the ravine. Wade lay sprawled on his back, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from a wound at his temple. But he was breathing, his chest rising and falling shallowly. As Matthew knelt beside him, Wade's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with recognition. "Sullivan," he rasped, "come to watch me die?" "Come to bring you to justice," Matthew corrected, examining the head wound. "Though it seems fate might have other ideas." Wade coughed, a wet sound that suggested internal injuries. "Justice," he repeated, the word a mockery on his lips. "What do you know of justice? The world doesn't work that way. The strong prey on the weak. Always have, always will." "Not if good people stand against it," Matthew replied, echoing what he had told Emma. "Not if they stand together." A ghost of a smile twisted Wade's bloodless lips. "Noble sentiments. But you've won nothing. Cut off one head, two more grow in its place." "Then we'll keep cutting," Matthew said grimly, "until there are no more heads to grow." Wade's breathing was becoming more labored, his skin taking on the gray pallor that Matthew, as a doctor, recognized all too well. The internal injuries were severe, beyond what field medicine could address. "The children," Wade gasped, his voice fading. "They were merchandise, nothing more. Why risk everything for them?" Matthew thought of Emma, of her resilience, her courage, her trust in him. Of Daniel, who had helped him at the mine despite his own fear. Of all the children who had suffered yet maintained their humanity when those who should have protected them had none. "Because they're children," he said simply. "Because they deserve better than men like you." Wade's eyes fixed on something beyond Matthew, beyond the ravine, beyond the Wyoming night. "My father said I was weak," he whispered. "That I would never measure up, never be a man." Then Preston Wade, banker, businessman, trafficker of children, shuddered once and was still, his final confession hanging in the cold night air. Matthew checked for a pulse, found none, and closed the dead man's eyes. Justice had been served, after a fashion. Not in a courtroom as Judge Hollister had intended, but in a lonely ravine under the vast Wyoming sky. Not by the law's hand, but by fate's. Yet as Matthew climbed back to his waiting horse, he felt no triumph, only a weary relief that one chapter of a terrible story had finally closed. The ride back to Wade's estate was slower, more cautious. Matthew leading Wade's injured horse, the banker's body draped across its saddle. The gunfire had ceased by the time he arrived, the battle over. Isaiah met him at the stables, relief washing over his face at Matthew's return. "Wade?" Isaiah asked, eyeing the burden on the horse. "Dead," Matthew replied. "Fell into a ravine while fleeing. Pierce got away." Isaiah nodded grimly. 4 of Wade's men dead, 3 captured. Sheriff Walker's wounded but alive. 1 deputy dead, 1 injured. The judge? The children? Still safe as far as we know. No reports of attacks at the camp. Matthew dismounted stiffly, his body finally registering the exertions and injuries of the night. "We need to get back to them." With Wade dead and Pierce fled, his remaining men might seek revenge on the witnesses. They worked quickly, loading the wounded onto horses and wagons, requisitioned from Wade's estate. Within an hour, they were riding back toward the camp, a somber procession bearing news of victory bought at a high price. Dawn was breaking when they reached the hollow where they had left the children. The golden light of sunrise spilled over the eastern hills, painting the landscape in hues of amber and rose. As they approached, Matthew scanned anxiously for signs that all was well. Abigail Reed was the first to emerge from the shelter of the rocks, rifle still in hand, dark circles beneath her eyes speaking of a sleepless night. Behind her came Judge Hollister, looking pale but alert, his illness seemingly held at bay by sheer willpower. And then, running ahead of the other children, came Emma. Her face lit up at the sight of Matthew, and she raced toward him as he dismounted. "You came back," she cried, flinging herself into his arms. "Just like you promised." Matthew held her close, feeling the last of the night's tension drain from his body. "Of course I came back," he murmured against her hair. "I'll always come back to you." Over Emma's shoulder, he met Abigail's questioning gaze. He nodded once, confirmation that their ordeal was truly over. Wade was dead, his operation exposed. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. The children would be safe now. They would find homes, families, healing. And Emma would have a home with him at Sundown Ranch. A new beginning for both of them, built on the ashes of their separate pasts. As the sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, Matthew Sullivan held his adopted daughter and looked toward the horizon, not west, where his ranch lay, but east, where the rising sun promised a new day, a new life, a future bright with possibility. "Let's go home," he whispered to Emma. And in that moment, for the first time in 7 years, the word home felt true again, felt earned, felt like a promise he could keep. 3 months passed. Sundown Ranch transformed under the Wyoming summer sun. The fields rippled gold in the breeze, and laughter, once a stranger to the place, now filled its rooms. Emma had flourished. Her nightmares grew less frequent, her smiles more common. She had claimed Catherine's old room as her own, though Matthew had offered her any room in the house. "This one feels right," she'd said simply, and Matthew understood. Some ghosts were meant to be embraced, not exorcised. The fate of the other rescued children had been settled with Judge Hollister's careful oversight. 4 had been reunited with families frantically searching for them, tearful reunions that Matthew and Emma had witnessed in Redemption's courthouse. 3 had been placed with carefully vetted families in nearby towns, where Hollister had connections he trusted. And Daniel, the brave boy who had helped at the mine, had found a home with Sheriff Walker and his wife, who had long wished for a child of their own. The remaining children had been taken to Denver by Judge Hollister himself, to be placed in a special home founded by a reformer who believed deeply in healing damaged young spirits. The judge had promised reports on their progress, and Matthew had promised Emma they would visit when the time was right. As for Pierce, word came 6 weeks after Wade's death. A telegram arrived from a marshal in Colorado Territory. Harrison Pierce apprehended attempting to cross into New Mexico. Evidence from Wade operation recovered, awaiting extradition. Sheriff Walker, still recovering from his wound but back on duty, had brought the news personally to Sundown Ranch. "He'll stand trial in the territorial capital," Walker had said, sitting at Matthew's kitchen table, cup of Victoria's coffee warming his hands. Between his confession and the evidence, he's looking at 20 years at least. The fall of Wade's operation had rippled across 3 territories. Other arrests followed, other operations exposed. The larger machine Pierce had boasted about was being dismantled, piece by piece. It wouldn't end the evil of child trafficking entirely. Matthew was not so naive as to believe that, but it had struck a meaningful blow against it. Today, Matthew stood on the porch watching Emma help Victoria hang laundry on the line. The girl's laughter carried on the summer breeze as she handed clothespins to the older woman, the two chattering in a mix of English and Spanish. The sound of an approaching wagon drew his attention. Abigail Reed sat at the reins, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she guided her horse up the drive. She had taken to visiting regularly since their return from Wade's estate, bringing books for Emma and increasingly reasons to speak with Matthew. Emma spotted her and ran to greet the wagon, corn husk doll, still her most treasured possession, tucked securely in her apron pocket. Victoria smiled knowingly at Matthew before disappearing back into the house. "Mrs. Reed," Emma called excitedly, "did you bring the book about stars you promised?" "I did," Abigail replied, setting the brake and climbing down. "And something else I thought you might enjoy." She reached into a basket and produced a small telescope, polished brass glinting in the sun. Emma's eyes widened with wonder. "It was my husband's," Abigail explained as she approached the porch, Emma dancing around her. "He loved to study the night sky. I thought perhaps you and your father might use it together." "Can we, Matthew, tonight?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes. "Of course," he replied, smiling at her enthusiasm. "After your lessons." Emma hugged the telescope to her chest and raced inside, eager to show Victoria her treasure. Matthew turned to Abigail, who stood at the bottom of the porch steps, her expression soft in the afternoon light. "That was very kind," he said. "She's been fascinated with the stars since I told her the story about travelers finding their way home." "Children need stories," Abigail replied, "and telescopes, and families." She hesitated, then added, "You've given her all 3. "I've tried," Matthew said, "though I'm still learning how to be a father again." "You're doing fine," she assured him, then glanced toward the house. "She's happy here. Anyone can see that." A comfortable silence settled between them. In the months since Wade's defeat, they had developed an easy friendship, built on shared experience and mutual respect. But lately, Matthew had found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that suggested something more. "Would you stay for dinner?" he asked suddenly. "Isaiah caught fresh trout this morning, and Victoria always makes too much." Abigail's gaze lingered on Matthew a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise of possibilities that neither was ready to name yet. "I'd like that," she said simply. Inside, Emma's laughter mingled with Victoria's. Outside, the Wyoming summer stretched endless and golden around Sundown Ranch. And somewhere between past and future, Matthew Sullivan found himself exactly where he needed to be. Home, in the truest sense of the word, surrounded by people who had helped him remember how to live again.